Thank you for joining us for our final of 4 Talk of the Town series discussions. I'm Adrienne Keeling, a city planner in the City of Carmel's Department of Community Services. We're hosting this series as part of a discussion to update our comprehensive plan. Those familiar, our comprehensive plan is known as the C3 plan. It was adopted in 2009 and has served us very well for more than a decade. As growth and investment in our city continues, we as a city need to continue to focus on the future by evaluating our policies and goals along with best practices related to growth, land use, transportation, and the environment. Leading our discussion this afternoon are representatives from consulting firms Green Street and Yard & Company, who have teamed up to help us update our comprehensive plan. Before I turn it over to Kevin Wright with Yard & Company to kick off today's discussion, I also want to mention at the end of today's webinar, we'll also be sharing some more information about next steps regarding the comprehensive plan. So with that, enjoy your lunch, and I'll turn it over to Kevin. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Adrienne, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Hello, welcome to Talk of the Town. As Adrienne said, my name is Kevin Wright, and I am a principal and co-founder at Yard & Company. We are an urban growth firm based in Cincinnati that has been commissioned with our partners at Green Street, an Indianapolis-based real estate development and consulting firm, to update Carmel's comprehensive plan. The City of Carmel and the Department of Community Services have hired our team because they need to update many aspects of the comp plan. This update will help to refine goals related to growth for the next 10 years. To put a decade into perspective for a moment, since the last drafting of the comprehensive plan, we have seen the near universal adoption of smartphones, which has, among other things, led to the rise of apps for deliveries and mobility. It's actually pretty amazing when you think about a decade ago, many of us did not have smartphones in our pocket. We've seen a spike in the baby boomer population over the last 10 years. We've seen 2 significant economic recessions, the most recent of which was brought on by the COVID-19 outbreak that we are still currently experiencing. Amidst all of this, Carmel has been doing well. We have made significant changes to the physical environment that has made us attractive to new employers, employees, visitors, residents. The growth of City Center and improvement of the Monon Trail through a new Midtown has established a strong urban core. The city has in many ways begun to grow up instead of out. This emerging pattern of redevelopment has necessitated a refreshed look at a lot of things, including mobility, public space, mixes of uses, urban densities, and resilience, both economically and environmentally. These are just some of the primary objectives inherent to this comp plan update that we're undertaking right now. As many of you know by now, Talk of the Town is a 4-part virtual series where we have been discussing different aspects of the comp plan and how issues such as mobility and land use might be updated in a way that continues to propel Carmel forward. This is the 4th and final Talk of the Town event. We have been holding these virtual events bi-weekly since February 26th. Each of these 4 webinars are being recorded and posted online so that stakeholders can view them on their own time and share them with their friends and neighbors. So before we get started, please feel free to ask questions via the chat feature at any time, and we'll do our best to answer the questions during the session. If we do not get to your questions, we will answer them and then post them on the Department of Community Services webpage. We'll give a link to that in a moment, but that is the home website for this planning process. If you are watching a recorded version of this, then please leave your questions in the comment section of the website where you are viewing the video, and we will answer your question. If you don't have a question, but only a comment, that's great. Please leave that as well, and we will log it and take it into consideration as we develop this update to the comp plan. So let's get started. Last week, our topic was unlock complementary growth. During that event, we talked about what we should be considering in the comp plan as we see new development patterns that we've seen in the core begin not just to happen there, but also in many parts of the city, and how we can continue to innovate as a city around design, mobility, and development patterns while respecting the historic traditions and patterns that have worked for Carmel over time. This week's topic is Shape the Growth. And with this topic, we are going to be discussing what community engagement can and should look like around growth and change as the city continues to evolve. Working together on this comp plan update, we are hopeful that we can establish new ways through this process to engage at the right time and the right scale in a way that positively drives new development and infrastructure that is respectful of our long-term history and vision. Mark is going to start us. I first want waiting room. How long on average does it take for a typical development project to receive zoning approval in Carmel? 3 months, 6 months, or 9 months? The answer is B, 6 months. And Mark, from our experience, this is not long or short, but actually is pretty efficient from a time perspective. And that said, today we want to focus and ask questions from the audience, not just on lengthening or shortening this process necessarily, but instead ensuring that we're focusing on the right things within that process. And that leads us to a question that we're going to start off with here. And before I read that, I want to say that today's show is a little different. We're going to be asking prompts and questions throughout the webinar, like this one, and asking you to jump in the chat feature and comment on them or ask another question. And this will help you shape our conversation. And we may not address all the questions and comments that come in, but we will be logging them, as I said earlier. And as Adrian said, we'll be discussing at the end what next steps look like in terms of public input and schedule for the comp plan update. So this question on the screen that we want to hear from you all on is what, from your perspective, is and is not working about the current process. And Mark, as they think on that, I'm going to hand it off to you, and you're gonna start by digging in a little bit into that process and what it entails currently today. Is that right?
Yes, right. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Adrian, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Yeah, we'll have a quick overview of the process and look forward to your comments. You can leave in the chat feature down at the bottom of your screen. So, Carmel is a fantastic city with many great places, continues to grow. And as we've covered in the past few episodes, despite having kind of built out most of its large undeveloped parcels and, reached a point where it cannot annex anymore, it's still attracting growth and investment. And so on smaller parcels or as redevelopment occurs, we want to talk about the process to shape and manage that growth in the way that helps us maintain and improve our quality of life and everything else that we love about Carmel. So in the typical life of a rezoning or project approval, this diagram outlines everything that happens kind of behind the scenes sometimes, or at least in the background, to make those great places come to life. And those buildings and public infrastructures and all sorts of improvements around the city are a result of a meticulous and careful process. Occurs over generally about 6 months, depending on the project, of course. There's variation there. With many different points to engage with either the public or neighboring business owners, landowners, residents, and check-in points. And the conversation mix for that takes many forms or occurs across many different medium. At the start, there's kind of a vision or a citywide planning process like this comprehensive plan. You can see on the next slide, Kevin. And these kind of high-level discussions set standards and eventually lead on to zoning and other ordinance regulations. And there are conversations involved with that. There are a lot of professional staff at the City of Carmel working to review all sorts of things related to safety and stormwater and connectivity and safe building codes and things like that to check to make sure that these developments are meeting Carmel standards. And of course, these days, there are many digital media to reach folks, whether that's surveys or Zoom and webinars, things like this. that have occurred, before and during and after the pandemic and will continue, but won't replace, in-person meetings as well and engagements either with the city or with a developer or a landowner. And then eventually moving through that process diagram, there are a few formal approval hearings with a plan commission or a city council or other similar bodies. That's just another part of the process for folks and residents and petitioners to be heard. And then eventually, obviously, dirt is broken, the ground is broken, and construction trucks are showing up on the site, and people certainly are interacting with projects once they see them physically come to life. And occasionally this is the first time people will interact with a project, but ideally at numerous points before then, they've had a chance to weigh in and think about it and see what's coming.
So all of those conversations and ways that we interact with growth and change and development across the city, they don't all happen at the same time, at the same place, nor are the questions that we ask at each step of the way the same as we go. So at that site planning or development scale, we can't ask any one project to solve every issue citywide. Conversely, at the comprehensive planning scale, the scale that we're working at right now, it's very hard to solve and reconcile every small detail in every corner of the city. In fact, at each step of the way, we have to be asking ourselves different questions about where we're headed as a city, how do we calibrate that to specific locations or areas within the city at the small area scale, and then how individual projects can contribute and perform to meet that broader vision. Carmel has been very good historically at planning for growth at the comprehensive scale, and then boiling it down to what that means at a small area scale, and then making sure that each project that comes before an approval body meets those objectives next. So at that comprehensive plan scale, we're asking ourselves really big questions about what has changed, what hasn't changed, who are we, where are we headed, and looking corner to corner about things like land use, character, transportation and mobility, policies, and refreshing ourselves where we've been and asking ourselves where we want to be 10 years from now next. And so the types of questions that we're asking as we go through this type of process is all about that kind of broad North Star, that 10-year vision for where to head. What is and isn't working? What do we all share in common? What makes us unique? And how have our needs changed over the last 10 years? What are some of the trends that are happening that we need to acknowledge? And what has stayed the same? What do we hold true no matter how far into the future we're looking? And what are some of those key connections that need to be made? And so in terms of how we get to those answers and ask those questions, the level of engagement is right-sized to the scale of the city. We're talking to you today in a citywide type venue that's allowing people that maybe grew up in Carmel and don't even live in Carmel anymore to participate in the direction of the city. We're having workshops with leadership and electeds, interviewing staff and folks that are dealing with growth issues day in and day out. We're integrating ourselves, and we'll talk a little bit about this at the end, into civic events and public events to have these kinds of conversations. And we're popping up in neighborhoods in all corners of the city to ask ourselves what the next 10 years might hold. And we're doing that as an exchange. We're doing just as much intake as we are sharing some of the phenomena, the economics, the market, the demographics, and how they've already changed in Carmel and what that means looking ahead. And so when we hit pause here and ask you all a very important question, one thing we want you to think about as we go through today's conversation and beyond is, what is it about Carmel that has changed over the last 10 years that we need to reflect when we think about the next 10 years? And what are those things that we hold true that haven't changed, that we can all believe in, our commonalities, our common values, that we need to ensure stay the same as we move ahead?
And Joe, if I can just jump in real quickly to make sure everybody understands the process here. I mentioned the chat feature earlier. It's technically the Q&A feature, but that's where you can drop in your comments and questions to some of these bigger questions we're asking throughout.
Thanks, Kevin. So our next scale here is kind of our middle scale, looking at small area planning. If you could advance the slide there. And this is not citywide, but focused on a particular intersection or even a corridor, feeling development pressures or that might have significant infrastructure improvement coming in a little bit shorter time frame, 3 to 5 years out in the future. And since we're still larger than the individual project, we're thinking about how a new development or new buildings will fit into the existing fabric. So we're really focusing on edges and transitions, personality and character of a particular district or neighborhood or corridor in the city. Questions that we're trying to answer in this case are, how are we applying the larger vision and goals from the comprehensive plan to this specific part of town? What are the amenities and infrastructure needs to meet that need or vision? And specifically in this part of town, where are the development pressures starting to be realized and our properties starting to redevelop, and where the new building is going to be springing up here soon? So we need to be planning for them and thinking about how they can integrate. Who's going to use these buildings? Are they employment or residential? And what is the identity of the area now? And how do we want these new developments to fit into that or strengthen that, and where we want to be, a few years down the road? And then in the public realm, again, those infrastructures, but also just how does the ground floor and how do these buildings interact and interrelate to each other, so that as we're, walking along the street or driving by, it all fits and feels cohesive. And then, to help make that happen, there needs to be generally calibrating or recalibrating of particular land use regulations or zoning ordinances to see that realized. So to engage then at this scale and answer those sorts of questions, it's a little bit more boots on the ground and speaking with neighbors, business owners, visitors even to the area, neighborhood associations, HOAs, other subcommittees that might have an interest in an area will be engaged. And some of the rolling up of their sleeves could be at a design charrette or a workshop where people think about the details at this stage and are drawing and thinking about where everything is going to go. We might see pop-up engagements at a booth where just passersby can come, or more planned meetings at a table with folks, and trying to just get a lot of the people in the area coming by now and using the area now to chime in, so we can get a well-rounded response from everyone involved in sharing the stake. And then eventually, there may be rezoning meetings or plan adoption meetings to sometimes formalize a small area plan or a particular part of that small area. So the natural question then to you all that I'd invite you to leave a comment in the chat, or the Q&A rather, is what part of towns do you think need to have a closer look? And, compared to where we've been in the last 10 years, looking forward 3 to 5 years, where are things changing? Where are their development pressures? And do we need to reconsider some small areas of Carmel right now?
So you can probably tell by now kind of the nesting dolls of engagement and discussion around charting a course for the future of Carmel. We've talked about the comprehensive plan process as a thing, as a process that we're in right now, actively engaging folks around the future of the city. And then we had, as a follow-up to that, small area planning, where we take that broad North Star and those principles and policies that we hold dear, and actually starting to apply that and interpret that for specific locations within the city of Carmel, measuring in miles, not citywide. And if we've done our job right, when we get to the scale of an individual project, there are very few surprises when a particular development comes forward. And we're starting to ask ourselves really specific questions about how that development fits into its immediate context, how it starts to fulfill not only the broad North Star vision of the city in its own way, because again, it can't do everything for all aspects of that policy statement, How does it fulfill the vision outlined in the small area plan? And then how does it work on a kind of day-to-day basis with people that are going to come out of their front porch every day and look at that development? So this is a really good opportunity to ask ourselves a different set of questions and how this all works. And in Carmel, as we mentioned in the trivia question, it's actually developed a pretty efficient way to host these conversations, to lay out a clear set of expectations for what constitutes the level of standard and care for a project, has laid out a clear and coherent process for how those conversations develop and evolve and shape and improve projects, and then how they go and get approved and built. But during this process, we can still ask ourselves how things can be modified and adapted and changed. And so it's worth it. Just reminding ourselves, what are the types of questions at the development scale that we're able to start to meaningfully address? I already mentioned, figuring out how does a specific project align with the small area plan? How does it do what it can do well in achieving the broader mission and goals and policy of the city? Are there new connections that can be made that were outlined in the small area plan that the development can actually make? What types of amenities and public goods is it starting to provide? And then we can start asking ourselves, okay, what are some of the mechanics? Did the zoning that we established anticipate this type of project? Do we need to actually go through a rezoning process as part of this? If we did our small area planning well, the zoning has already been somewhat teed up, and that conversation had. How does the aspects of the building that we interact with most, how do they start to inform the public realm? How does the first 16 feet of that building really work? Does it have the right amount of transparency? Is it welcoming? If it's a retail, how does the storefront work? If it's residential, how does the front porch work? What are some of the access issues with where do the driveways go? Where do the parking areas go? Landscape, servicing. If it's a larger project, how does it phase? And then, most importantly, maybe once the project is approved, is really figuring out a smart way to do construction so that those impacts, the dusty roads, the construction fencing, the dump trucks, all the things that go into building a building or a development, how are we mitigating the impacts off-site so as to minimize the impact on our quality of life as development is occurring? In a fast-growing city such as Carmel, these are real things that we have to be able to manage. And so the way we get to those answers is also scaled to the development. We're no longer traveling citywide or asking how a development's going to solve all the problems. We're actually interacting with developers on the specifics of that project, with neighbors and abutters about how the project will fit into the immediate context. Some details around what matters in that building most in terms of the public-facing facades and landscape of the building. And then we're moving into an approval process in that chart that we started the presentation with, and getting the project aligned and then ultimately approved and then built. And then as the project is getting constructed, and even after it's constructed and occupancy has been gained, is what is the level of engagement of the neighborhood in this development? Is it going to be a standalone development and stand off? Or is it going to integrate itself into the character and life of its context? So engagement doesn't really stop, and the conversation doesn't really stop even after the development is up and running. And so as you're listening to all this, not only at the comprehensive plan scale and the small area plan, but even thinking about specific projects that you may be aware of or part of, what has gone well? Which projects did not go so well and why? Help us reflect on this process and understand how things can be improved as it relates to the development process.
Thank you guys for that. I don't have a ton of questions flowing in yet, but so I'm going to start with a comment and then see if those start coming in a little bit more, filters, go through some of these that are popping in now. Multitasking here. So I think it's really interesting how we've laid out today, the process of what it looks like today to approve a development, particularly through a zone change. We've also laid out really three stackable processes. One is this comp plan, which we're going through now, and it is about the North Star, the big vision, the things that might affect the entire city, right? And so everybody is involved, as many people are as can be are involved with helping shape that vision for 10 years out, shaping the comp plan. And then below that is the small area plan, which is more in depth, in detail, and focused on some of the granular design and development aspects of a project that will affect the day-to-day lives of the people living in that neighborhood or on that street, down to really the level of detail, Mark and Joe, around if I have a front porch and I look out on a new project across the street, what is the landscaping? Where are the curb cuts? Where do people park? And then within that, once that project, a project like that within a small area plan gets approved or it goes through a process, what does that process look like? And so there are sort of these stackable components. I guess my first question, and I'm sure this will prompt additional questions, is what can the comp plan do and what can't it do around those two subcomponents? We may not be able to answer all of that today, but sometimes I'll just start. Small area planning is part of a comp plan. Sometimes a comp plan recommends areas that should receive small area planning, and small area planning follows a comp plan. And then, what can a comp plan do around recommendations for approvals for developments? You guys want to jump in on that topic?
Yeah, I can take a first stab. I mean, I think predictability is one outcome here. At this comp planning level, and these webinars are an example. It's sometimes a little bit conceptual and necessarily high level, since we are kind of talking citywide, and predictability should be a result not only for current residents who might live nearby and be seeing development pressures, or might be getting offers from investors to buy their home, or they're seeing changes down the street. As these small area plans, for instance, or other similar engagements results after a comprehensive plan update, the mystery can be cleared a little bit about what's coming and what needs to come and how can we manage these new changes or new pressures. But then also just knowing that, a property owner is allowed to sell their land, and, when an investor comes to Carmel within, the bounds of the laws and regulations, they're allowed to invest, of course. So attracting the right sort of investment and having a clear vision can not only help set expectations for current residents or current business owners who are running a business, say, nearby, but also make it clear, this is what we're looking for, this is what we want to protect, this is what matters to us, and these are our values. So there are no surprises for the would-be developer or for the plan commission or city councilor, the elected officials, whose job it is to kind of represent constituents in Carmel in those negotiations. There should just be a lot more predictability and what to expect and where we want to go and what we need to protect.
Yeah, I think the way I look at it is that the comprehensive plan isn't a zoning document. It isn't a master plan for the city. It isn't even specifying the type and quantity of development that will happen in one area over another. I think at its core, a comprehensive plan is a statement, an identity citywide that says for existing residents and business owners and leaders, this is who we are, this is what we believe in, this is what we are going to prioritize as we grow, based on a solid understanding of where we've been and what unique attributes of the city we have that we can take advantage of. But then it also becomes an outward facing document to, in lesser cities, it would be to your neighboring jurisdictions. But for Carmel, it's a message and a broadcast to the entire country and even beyond as why or what makes Carmel Carmel. Why, if you're a new resident, Carmel is an attractive option. What are those quality of life features? What are those amenities that make Carmel Carmel? Or if you're a owner of a company and you're looking to relocate, why is Carmel a better option than some Austin or Nashville? So it's a bit of a branding and a storytelling document as well, in addition to a kind of bold statement about who Carmel is. The small area plans is where the rubber kind of starts hitting the road. That's where things like zoning and thinking about height and the building envelope and even things about quantity and market forces start to really take shape, where we can have a strategic conversation as a neighborhood, no longer as a whole city, but really as a neighborhood where that potential exists, to talk about what makes Home Place different than, say, the neighborhoods to the east or to Old Town and the Arts District. Really focusing in on what attributes that neighborhood has, how it's going to reflect in its own trajectory those broader ideals in the comprehensive plan, and what specific investments need to be made to not only improve the quality of life in that neighborhood or district, but how can we get ahead of development that might be interested in that location. Oftentimes, small area plans are chosen based on the opportunity that is perceived in a neighborhood or in a place. If there are empty or vacant sites, or if there are housing pressures, there's some kind of problem or opportunity that needs addressing that preempts the small area plan. And so that's where the kind of the parameters of development really get set. And then if that all goes well, if it's doing its job, the development planning stage is really where we're just asking questions of the development and saying, are you doing your part to fulfill what the small area plan and the comprehensive plan said? And if so, then we're not opening up all those larger conversations again. We're finding a path to yes. If it doesn't, then we need to ask more of it and say, come back, do more thinking about this particular development so that you meet the clear expectations that Mark mentioned in very specific ways, and make sure that it integrates into not only the broad vision for the city, but its immediate context.
Thanks, Mark and Joe. Questions are starting to roll in, and I'm trying to do my best to, in a way, combine a few of them because they do hit on some repeating threads. One question is, are there best-in-class features, processes, et cetera, at each of these three levels that Carmel lacks currently? I think that's a good question for us to touch on, although Joe, you just touched a little bit on that. And I want you to I want us to answer that question through the lens of concerns around protecting single-family neighborhoods from development or projects that maybe are perceived as to not fit in, and that touches on things like density and how, as development continues to be in high demand in these areas, how do we not just respect the existing fabric of the place, but also make sure there's public space and places for kids to play, et cetera. And then also within that, just a kind of a repeated comment around making sure that residents of the place are involved in the process as much as possible from beginning to end. So all of that circling back to the question of, have we seen best of class processes at these three levels that we can talk about for a moment that would help to alleviate some of those issues or concerns?
At the highest level, at this comprehensive plan level, I know one, I got a shortcoming. I mean, I don't mean that in a bad way, of the current C3 plan, like many comprehensive plans across the country, and certainly from 10 years ago, are very much, long documents. It's a big PDF. There's obviously a lot of issues and information to handle in plans and documents like this. So we're certainly aiming for a much more interactive and relatable tool, I guess we'll call it for now, that's online, easy to look at even via a smartphone. You know, we've talked about what's changed in the last 10 years. The finding of information about how to engage, or what are the current ordinances on the books, or, you know, what's the plan for this area, should be much easier, we're hoping for, after this process. And, you know, we've seen some examples around the country, and not only just with comprehensive plans, but just in general, how technology has enabled, in many ways, better transfer of information and communication and engagement with things like these. So at the comprehensive plan level, that's certainly what we're aiming for here in this process.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and Joe, I'll let you chime in too. We've seen in our work, and we've been involved in this work, where there might be a comp plan, right, which sets the vision. And it says, as a city, we want to be these big things. We want to solve these big problems. There is then a small area plan that gets down into the detail on the shape and size of development and where and when it goes. But in terms of the actual process of approving a development, oftentimes with small area plans that get into the weeds on specific size and shapes of projects, you can develop a scorecard that then allows for the administration of the city to ensure that the development is reflective of that small area plan, which theoretically had a lot of community engagement within the block or neighborhood where it was done. And if that scorecard isn't hit a certain threshold, then it takes a couple steps back and rethinks itself. And then the scorecard becomes a presentation tool when it is time to begin discussing the project with the neighborhood. It shows transparently what the administration walked through to get to that point. I also think, Mark, you're touching on a good point in terms of what is the first touch point. Not only what is the first touch point with residents of a street or a neighborhood, but when. On the what side, in the past, not so much in Carmel, but just historically, it's often an envelope that comes in the mail. And what we've seen is that that's not the most positive of first impressions, right? Is getting something in the mail from the city. In terms of when, which is a question that's coming up quite a bit here, is how can we get residents involved in as early in the process as possible? And I think that challenge is really centered around this idea of when does a project become real? If a project might be in discussion phase with the city for quite some time before it's really ready for the prime time.
And just to bring it back up to the scale of the comprehensive plan, I think it's important to remind ourselves of the arc of the kind of broader narrative that we've been sharing in these webinars, where when Carmel was growing outward at a very fast clip, the comprehensive plan as a device was really used to manage that outward expansion. And it could be, for lack of a better phrase, a chunkier document, as Mark alluded to, that's dealing with some big, broad swaths of territory that were being developed, and paint with a very broad brush. Well, as we've discussed, as Carmel has moved to the edges, it's now land constrained. It is now looking more inward for maybe those sites that were leapfrogged or closer to the core, even some redevelopment of sites. It goes from being a broad growth shaping tool that's covering a lot of territory to much more surgical, working with a scalpel instead of a large paintbrush, and being very intentional about a couple things. One is just acknowledging that Carmel has a lot of existing places that need to be protected and enhanced and built around or connected to, varying on the location. But then there are other areas where, so it needs to acknowledge that. And then the other area that it needs to acknowledge is that that we have to allow for a certain amount of incrementalism and evolution and hard to predict forces such as market, demographics, economics, and that kind of thing, and provide enough wiggle room so that when we get to the level of the small area plan, then we can be pretty responsive to those changing forces without losing sight of what we hold dear and prioritize. So moving from a big broad brush to more of a surgical approach is the kind of mode that the comprehensive plan is in now, where historically that wasn't as necessary. And then when we get to the small detail or the specific development plan level, where I think the best the best practices are, and at Carmel is still, I think, doing quite well in, is having constructive discussions on getting to a project that works for as many people as possible. We've worked in many cities where that process is pretty broken, and that a development of a pretty small site can be held up for years as it tries to absorb and respond to all of the challenges being placed upon it and all the problems it needs to quote unquote solve through a very small project that can't really impact those broader needs. And I think what Carmel does really well and is in a leader of is and historically has always been a leader of, is getting out in front of those issues and setting the broad tenets for what it believes in. And then it has done, if you look in the 09 plan, it has done a handful of small area plans that start to bring that into more detail. I think if there was anywhere where I think Carmel will continue to need to evolve and develop its sophistication around, it's the small area planning, particularly when you're dealing with a scalpel and not a broad brush. The small area planning becomes extremely critical to setting the vision for a particular area of the city. So I think if we look in the next 10 years, that will become something that Carmel probably grows more sophisticated in than maybe it has been in the past.
Great, and that touched on one of the questions, the most recent questions that came in, which is, kind of a critical comment of the idea of the comp plan. If it doesn't have real teeth, like a zone change or a small area plan, for instance, what is the purpose? And just to repeat that, I think it's a good question. But as we mentioned in the opening statement, so much has changed in the world over the last 10 years that an every decade or so refresh of priorities, values, vision is needed, and can really then set the table for the focused efforts around new small area plans, maybe new zoning, new processes that can meet people where they are in the 21st century. So I think all that's great because it helps everybody that's here today think through what we are doing. And while we aren't passing a new zoning regulation, for instance, we are having a conversation about the future and what we want to avoid and what we want to make sure happens and where. And so this is an important conversation. I have another question. What standards, and this gets into what a comp plan can and can't do, of course, but through this process, what standards could we possibly be recommending for possible infill projects, particularly in large lot residential areas? But there's and this touches back on, with potential density increases, how do we save open space for parks? But this question also touches on how we might recommend infill projects for large asphalt parking lots.
So in general, and I'd refer folks to our third webinar where we talked, I believe it's the third, we talked about our development pattern areas. That's really where we're going to be talking about, the west neighborhoods, the east neighborhoods, the White River corridor, the core of the city. It's really at that level that we'll be talking about what development should look like, should it come. Because, we won't, certainly with this process, we won't be picking out parcels or properties, that need to be densified, or, these are problem parcels that need to be changed. The development patterns should really make a clear statement, kind of connecting to another question on what's the point of a comp plan. for each of those development areas, this should be the clear vision that's coherent and vetted by many of the folks who have a stake there in that particular part of town with what they want to see, what they don't want to see, so that conversations with their elected officials representing them and with the private market as they come or consider coming to invest or build or not, there's just clear lines of sight on what we want to see here. And it really depends on where that is in the city. It's different if it's a retail strip center that's maybe dated and has some vacancy, and the way it's been built and recently performing makes clear that it's not going to be working here in the next 5-10 years. Handling a problem in a redevelopment project like that on a major street, near maybe other shopping or commercial or near a hospital, that's a different sort of a question and answer than in residential parts of town. In residential areas, the driving forces are, well, how do we protect the character that's there? It makes, so many of the neighborhoods of Carmel wonderful places to live. And, for many folks to build wealth and the equity of their home and raise a family. But as their needs change, as families' needs change, if, multi-generational households are increasing, or, as baby boomers who maybe moved here when they were 50 are at a different point in their lives at 60 or 65, how can or should Carmel adjust to meet the needs as folks move different lives through their life stages, and maybe selling a home or moving from ownership to a rental or vice versa, and may want to stay in Carmel. So it really depends on which part of the city that we're in to answer that.
Yeah, and just to kind of lay it out using a hypothetical example, because the open space was mentioned in the question. The comprehensive plan may say that public space is really important to the neighborhood's quality of life. I'm being really vague here, but it'll say that kind of policy type statement. And then if it outlines a particular area in the city, it'll say that parks are a defining character of, say, the west or east neighborhoods. So that's the comprehensive plan. The small area plan will say, okay, we understand our city to be a city of parks and neighborhoods. In this area, there is a potential for, as development occurs, a new park. This is the character of that park. It can generally locate in this area. It's this big. It connects these things. It may have, in general, these uses. And then as development happens, that's when that park gets articulated to the point of, these are the construction documents. This is where the splash pad is going to go, or the play equipment, or the trails. This is the plant palette. This is when it's going to get built, and this is how much it's going to cost. So it follows that path, and you can take that same course through all sorts of subject matter in the built environment. You can do that with streets, where the comprehensive plan may say, this is the menu of streets that Carmel builds. This is the menu of streetscape, meaning the edges of the streets that Carmel builds. That gets set at the comp plan level. At the small area plan, we say, okay, this is the location for this street type, whether it's improving a street that's already there or creating a new connection. And this is the needs that street has from a streetscape perspective in terms of sidewalks, paths, bike racks, this, that, or the other thing. And then when a development gets built within that small area, or a significant improvement to an existing property gets made, that streetscape, for instance, may be installed for the length of that development, implementing incrementally the vision that street was created at the small area plan level. So just a couple of examples of how you go from comprehensive plan through small area plan into actually seeing something built.
Another question about best practices, this time asking about education, engagement, and advocacy for citizens in the planning and zoning process. I can start there. I think in terms of engagement, one thing we've seen, which is a relatively slight adjustment that makes a big difference, is where the meeting takes place. So if there is a meeting about a project, where and at what time it takes place can be a meaningful change that really expands the number of people involved. So instead of, say, downtown at a city building and during the day, it could be in the evening at a recreation center in the neighborhood, allowing people to have better access to a meeting. Also, not, from our perspective, not just relying on the public meeting, but giving people opportunities to engage, as Mark was saying earlier, either digitally or through an open office hours type situation where they can come on their own time and their own schedule. In terms of education, we've seen in other places where there is a regular, maybe this is hosted by a nonprofit group or somebody in town, but a regular series, very similar to this one, but maybe in person as well as virtual, where citizens can learn more from developers about their needs and what they have to overcome in terms of building something, and just learning more what that process looks like and bridging the gap a little that often is too wide between citizens and developers. Touching on another question, Joe, if you can do it in about 4 minutes, circling back to the small area planning. Can you provide just a little more detail on what engagement might look like for something like that? And then how we would define stakeholders in a process like that? And just to help kind of start it off, thinking through, typically small area plans are focused in areas where there are somewhat large development sites and there's an increasing market demand where we might see development coming in the next 3 to 5 years, and we want to get ahead of it.
Yeah, it's a great question. Because you gave me all of 4 minutes, I'm going to take the first 30 seconds to build on what you already said.
Okay.
The way I look at education is not around, particularly when it's within the context of a planning process. I think the series you talked about that people can opt into to learn more is a great idea. But when you're in a process, it's less about telling people stuff and educating them. I mean, Carmel's full of really smart people. It's more about reminding people and holding up a mirror and saying, this is what we're hearing and learning from you all. These are the commonalities. This is where there's disagreement. This is the data around how households are changing, how incomes are changing, how jobs and mobility to those jobs is changing, and then have a discussion and remind ourselves through that discussion who we are, what we want to prioritize, and what the future might look like given those priorities. Specific to the small area plan, I think it's a really, as professionals, it's the area that we really get most excited about in many ways, because it's still big picture enough to think about 3 to 5 years out how a neighborhood could improve and become a better version of itself. But it's detailed enough where there's some real discussions being had about real properties and what the future of those properties might be. And so when you think about the venues and the types of conversations and who's considered stakeholders in a process like that, it kind of starts and ends with the neighborhood in many respects. When we do this type of work, we don't typically park ourselves down in City Hall or in a convention center somewhere in some hotel. We find a location within the neighborhood where we can embed ourselves into the day-to-day life of the neighborhood and allow people to interact in an organic way with the planning process. It also makes our work much smarter, given that we're seeing how the neighborhood works, seeing what the opportunities might be for a street or an undeveloped piece of property. And then it allows the conversations to become richer and with a broader array of neighborhood business owners or residents. It also becomes a great way to keep the focus on the neighborhood. Oftentimes, if we relocate that exercise out of the neighborhood, it then falls into that trap that we discussed before, where issues that pertain to a very specific geography start to be opened up to the scale of the city. And that can cut both ways in being an equitable discussion or not. But what de-risks that is actually housing it in the neighborhood. And then when it comes specifically to public infrastructure in the public realm and the amenities that we like to envision as part of a small area plan that the neighborhood desires or potentially could see. We mentioned in our last episode the importance or opportunity in doing small test pilots, demonstration projects that may talk about how a public space might work, or how an intersection might be improved, or how a street could be calmed so that traffic goes slower and becomes safer to cross. Those kinds of initiatives and demonstration projects can actually be pulled right into the design exercise of a small area plan, so that there's a really direct link between evaluating what works and doesn't work and what the ultimate built result might look like.
Okay, great. Mark,
Kevin, if I could,
yeah,
there's a question on affordable housing and how can a comp plan address or include affordable housing. I think that's an important one just to bring up. That can mean many things, and I think the answer is wide ranging. You know, if it's say for aging seniors who maybe want to downsize, or they're empty nesters and they want to stay in Carmel, you know, age in place, so to speak, not necessarily in their own house, but stay in Carmel, then it's addressing what are the needs of these seniors? Who are they? Let's talk with them, think about what they want in a new home, so that the conversations around a housing type or a price point are specific to those, say, who want to age in Carmel and stay in place. And related to another question, who are the stakeholders? If affordable housing relates to, say, the workforce and employers in Carmel, I think it's sometimes a voice that isn't heard are the people in charge of hiring, say, at a hospital, you know, and they may have different workforce needs, or, you know, a new company moves to town, and if they have hiring needs, that needs to play in as well, because those occur across the income spectrum, and that can, you know, relate to transportation conversations as well. So it ties in many different ways, and I think a comp plan should, you know, make clear this is our vision, and kind of a policy, you know, there'll be a policy chapter in the C3 plan. It was the plan essence chapter on, you know, this is what's important for us in terms of housing attainability and affordability, and then working that in then to the individual development pattern areas around the city, and figuring out how they fit in and meeting what needs specifically, instead of just thinking conceptually affordable housing, because that, you know, that term can mean a lot to different people.
okay, great. Thanks for bringing that up. I think that touches on why a comp plan is important. I think whether it's housing or employment or parks, you know, as Mark just laid out, if you set a value or a priority on something, some aspect of housing or some aspect of employment, it trickles down and starts to shape how we think about all aspects of placemaking and all aspects of change. So I think that's a good point closing out here. Well, thank you guys for the time today. This was fun. I want to walk through what is next for this comp plan update process as we close out here. On our earlier slide where we talked about engagement tactics for a comp plan, we touched on a few of these. And just to set the big picture here, we have been engaging with the city, focus groups and stakeholders who are heavily involved and deeply involved in the process of change and growth. There was a survey, a digital survey as part of this process. We've had these 4 webinars where we've been talking with you and collecting comments and questions. There was a question about where and when the comments and questions from these 4 webinars will be posted. We'll be posting those very soon on the project website, which you can see at the bottom of the screen here. You know, COVID-19, thankfully for all of us, has begun to improve. The warm weather is upon us. And so now that we feel safe to gather in some ways, we're going to start May 5th through 8th, which is a Wednesday through Saturday, coming to town and doing pop-ups around town, locations to be determined, where we will engage people where they are and have conversations around concepts that are being developed within the comprehensive plan. We'll also have a home base as part of that. We'll have open office hours where people can pop in and talk to us and share their concerns or their hopes and dreams for the future with us. We'll probably also be scheduling strategic meetings in that space with people to talk about certain topics. So that'll be a very intense 4-day period where we're going to try to engage with a lot of people. So keep that on your calendar and look out for more announcements about that. That should theoretically lead to the draft of a comprehensive plan this summer, which will then lead to a plan adoption process that will include Planning Commission and City Council and the opportunity to engage there as well. So that is a quick update on where we're heading next. Again, thank you to everyone who joined us today. As I mentioned, this is the final Talk of the Town event. If you think of comments or questions after we finish today, head over to the planning website and talk to us there, and make sure and send us an email, and keep an eye out for the recorded version of today's discussion as well. We'll be posting that on the website next week, and of course the city's YouTube page. And if you can, please share that with your friends and neighbors. Tell them this is an important process we're going through, and see if they can also become part of it. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us and spending your 4th lunch break with us. We do appreciate it. We will see you soon. Have a great weekend.